Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of our Connecting East and West podcast. With me, your host, journalist Luis Alberto Pino. Connecting East and West is an initiative by East Consulting, the leading business and legal advisory firm bridging businesses between Asia and Latin America. Connecting East and West is your monthly space dedicated to bringing helpful ideas and high caliber views on the business landscape of these two regions. Connecting East and West by East Consulting is your partner to connect and make the most out of both regions. I'm sure you're going to enjoy the next 25 minutes with our very special guest today, Ambassador Jorge Heine, who is a prestigious expert in international relations and a diplomat with a particular interest in the international politics of the so-called Global South. Ambassador Heine has served as Chile's ambassador to China between 1994 and 1999, India between 2003 and 2007, and South Africa between 1994 and 1999, as well as a member of the Chilean cabinet. He's been a member of the Chilean cabinet as well. Jorge is currently a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, a think tank in the United States, and previously served as a research professor of international relations at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing, and a visiting professor of international relations at Sichuan University in Chengdu. He is the co-author of the book that we're going to be talking about today, The Non-Aligned World, Striking Out in an Era of Great Power Competition, and author of China in the Century of the Dragon, What Everyone Should Know About China. Ambassador Heine, welcome.
Good morning, Luis. Thank you for the opportunity.
My pleasure. Thank you for being here. So let's begin. Your book, your latest book, highlights the monumental moment of transformation the world is undergoing, as significant as one that shaped the global landscape of the Cold War. Is this the reason why you and the other co-authors decided that it was the right time to dive into this matter in this book?
Well, we have been working on this concept, the notion of active non-alignment that we put forward in this new book for 6 years now. And what is extraordinary is the fact that the concept has become more and more current. Most recently, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Mark Carney, in his Davos speech, put forward the notion that the world is facing not a transition to a different world order, but rather a rupture with the previous world order, and that middle powers, both from North and South, need to get together to face this enormous challenge. Mr. Canning was also recently in China, arguing that Canada should not take sides in the contest that exists right now between the United States and China, but rather should keep its own counsel and, well, in fact, stand for a non-aligned position. So I would argue that this notion that we put forward 6 years ago, it has led to 2 books in Spanish and in English, an edited volume with contributions by 6 former Latin American foreign ministers. It has become more and more relevant for the enormous challenges the world faces today. Active non-alignment postulates that countries should put their own interests front and center, should make their foreign policy decisions according to that, and not take sides in this contest between China and the United States. The concept arose during the first Trump administration, when Latin America was in a very difficult situation. It was hit by the triple whammy, the pandemic, the ensuing economic recession, and then the pressures from the Trump administration. Under such circumstances, we came up with this notion. And in the second Trump administration, in which the pressures on Latin America in particular, but also on many countries around the world, have increased exponentially, the notion has become even more significant.
Excellent. Ambassador, the book mentions that the ANA, the active non-alignment concept, right? In essence, is what has been called playing the field, right? Quote unquote, playing the field, allowing middle power countries, many of them in Asia and Latin America, by the way, to choose which aspects to align themselves with. In practical terms, Jorge, how do you propose that middle powers, which is the case for a number of countries in Asia and Latin America, as I said, could independently exercise this?
Well, often people say, given how tense the situation has become and how fierce the competition between the United States and China has become, that many countries will not they will simply have to decide to take sides. Well, we think that is wrong, precisely because there is this competition. This means that there is no longer a monopoly of international power as there was during the so-called unipolar moment. Now there is a duopoly. There is a very even playing field between China and the United States in economic terms, and therefore countries can pick and choose. Let me give you an example. Brazil is, to my mind, one of the foremost examples of applying active non-alignment, and to do it very successfully. Recently, President Trump pressured Brazil to end the trial against former President Bolsonaro because of his attempted military coup. President Bolsonaro is a good friend of Mr. Trump. Well, Brazil said, no, this is a national sovereignty matter. We are not going to do that. We are happy to discuss trade matters, but we're not going to get into matters that relate to our internal political system. As a result of that, the United States imposed 50% tariffs on Brazil, which is the highest tariffs for any country in the world. Many people thought that Brazil would give in. Well, Brazil didn't. And in this contest with the United States, Brazil won. The United States ultimately dropped the tariffs because the price of beef and coffee went up in the United States so much that it didn't have much of a chance to do otherwise. So I think that is an excellent example of how countries can apply active non-alignment.
Now that you pointed out the case of Brazil, I guess that the same can be said about India, for example. And you know that India and the U.S. just reached an agreement, I think, just a few days ago regarding tariffs as well, right? So this is the same case, basically, with an example in Latin America and in Asia.
Absolutely. India also was slammed with 50% tariffs because Mr. Trump was unhappy by the fact that India did not recognize what he argued was a key role in ending the war between India and Pakistan last May. Well, again, 50% tariffs, India did not give in, and now we have a trade agreement between the United States and India. So you're quite right. There is another example. But it's important, Luis, to keep in mind the following. It isn't only the big countries like Brazil and India that can apply active non-alignment. This also applies to smaller countries. Let me give you another example. The case of Ecuador. Ecuador in 2022 was facing severe economic difficulties in paying its foreign debt. And President Guillermo Lasso, a conservative businessman from Guayaquil, was president at the time, went to the United States asking for negotiating and signing a free trade agreement so that Ecuador could have what Colombia and Peru and Chile have, that is a free trade agreement with the United States. And the United States said, no, we are not signing free trade agreements anymore. So what did Mr. Lasso do? He went to Beijing. And in Beijing, they agreed on negotiating an agreement that was ratified and came into effect in May of 2024. So that's an excellent example of how even smaller countries like Ecuador can play both sides against the middle and ending up in a better position than before.
Excellent. Let me read something from your book, Ambassador, which I found very, very interesting. In the book, you state that active non-alignment corresponds to a specific foreign policy strategy that addresses what Arnold Wolfers called environmental objectives, quote unquote, environmental objectives, which are those goals related to the management of any state's external environment. I mean, as opposed to what he called possession objectives, right? So, which refer to the defense of the state's fundamental interests in the security, military, or economic realms, right? So, could you elaborate further on the value that you assign to environmental objectives for the purposes of the active non-alignment strategy?
Yes, absolutely. So what is very important to make the right foreign policy decision is to have a right diagnosis of what is happening in the international environment. Because if you make the wrong diagnosis, obviously you will come up with the wrong recipe. So the diagnosis in this case of this environment is the following. As opposed to a situation in the Cold War, when there was a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union then was a significant military, space, nuclear, and ideological power. But it was not a very significant economic power. It was a closed economy. Therefore, it could not compete with the United States in terms of trade flows, investment flows, financial flows. That put the Soviet Union at a distinct disadvantage. Now, that is not the case today. China is, according to PPP terms, a bigger economy than the United States. Some say it will be bigger in nominal terms by 2035. And it is, in some aspects, a more open economy than the United States, certainly signs free trade agreements. And it has, a very significant trade investment in financial flows with many countries around the world. So what does this mean? It means that countries have an option. They have an alternative. They are not bound to do business strictly with the United States. They can also go to China. And that is what gives them the opportunity to play the field, which is the grand strategy of active non-alignment.
Perfect. This is, of course, a podcast focused on exploring bridges between Asia and Latin America, Ambassador. You dedicate a whole chapter to ASEAN's experience as a model for countries that want to follow an active non-alignment strategy or policy, right? So, especially given how unlikely how unlikely it was that ASEAN would achieve its current position on the international stage. So, essentially, Ambassador, what should other countries in the global South pay closer attention to regarding the ASEAN experience? Why is the ASEAN experience so important for you?
The ASEAN experience is extremely important because this is a region that in some ways is quite comparable to Latin America. It has, with 10 member countries, ASEAN is a population of something like 650 million people, which is comparable to what Latin America has. Interestingly enough, its per capita income is somewhat lower than that of Latin America. But by working together, by having such a strong regional entity, they have achieved two very significant objectives. First, of course, regional integration has meant that their growth has been very high. Today, countries like Vietnam, like Indonesia, like Singapore, stand out for their significant economic achievements and dynamism. That's number one. But number two, they've also become a very important diplomatic reference. To the ASEAN meetings, we see the president of China, the president of the Russian Federation, the president of the United States going. So it has an extraordinary drawing power as a diplomatic entity. Latin America has nothing comparable to that. And the other point that is very important about the ASEAN experience is that, what we hear in Latin America quite a bit is that we are told that because we are in the Americas, there is something called the notion that geography is destiny. Therefore, in the end, we are bound to align ourselves with the United States because we are in the Western Hemisphere. Well, if that would be the case, you presumably would have to argue that ASEAN, because it is in the neighborhood of China, would also have to align itself with China. Because if geography is destiny, presumably this is a universal proposition. But in the case of East Asia and Southeast Asia, the United States makes the opposite argument. They say that because the ASEAN countries are so close to China, they need the United States to compensate that influence. And therefore, they should allow for even stronger military and other presence there. So our argument is this. Either geography is destiny is true, or it is not. It cannot be true for Latin America and not true for ASEAN. So ASEAN shows that developing nations, even those in the neighborhood of the big powers, can have an independent, non-aligned foreign policy.
I mean, I can't avoid this question. I mean, now that you mentioned the ASEAN experience, I mean, against the backdrop of the so-called Donro Doctrine, right? How that will be possible for Latin America? I mean, to follow the experience of the ASEAN countries against that backdrop. I mean, it seems so difficult right now, isn't it?
Well, there is no doubt that it is very difficult. And, Latin America, in a way, finds itself right now between a rock and a hard place. But here I would distinguish between Central America, the Caribbean, and Mexico on the one hand, and South America on the other. Part of the rationale for the Donro Doctrine is to diminish as much as possible China's influence in China's presence in the Western Hemisphere. For South America, China is today the #1 trading partner. Brazil trades $180 billion with China and runs a trade surplus. Chile trades $60 billion with China and runs a surplus. Uruguay, for Uruguay, it's the #1 trading partner. For Peru, it is. So now, that is not going to change. This is not something that, I mean, who is Brazil going to sell its soy and its beef? Who is Argentina going to sell its oil? Who is Chile going to sell its copper? So that is not going to change. And the Chinese companies that are setting up shop in Brazil and elsewhere, in Chile and Argentina, they are not going away. So I would say that this notion of diminishing the Chinese presence in South America is going to be very much an uphill task, and I don't see it happening anytime soon.
Thank you, Ambassador. This podcast, Connecting East and West, also aims to assess the business landscape between both regions, right? Between Asia and Latin America. When it comes to the business community, Ambassador, how does the active non-alignment strategy fit into the way businesses should plan operations and growth strategies going forward, right, against the current backdrop?
Sure. Well, here what is important to keep in mind is this. The fastest growing and most dynamic part of the world today is in East Asia and Southeast Asia. So for our countries in Latin America, we want to increase our growth. We want to make progress. And to do that, we need to connect with the fastest growing regions in the world. And that, of course, includes East Asia and Southeast Asia. So let me just illustrate this with one example. One of the reasons for Chile's considerable success over the past 35 years, Chile, according to the United Nations Human Development Index, is the country with the highest human development index in Latin America today. Why is that? That is because Chile, there are a number of reasons, but at least one of them is that Chile very early on in the early 90s identified East Asia and Asia in general as its #1 foreign trade and foreign investment objective. And it signed free trade agreements. The first free trade agreement between an Asian country and a Latin American country was signed by Chile and Korea in 2003. The first free trade agreement that China signed with any individual country was with Chile in 2005. I myself signed a trade agreement with India and Chile in 2006. So the connection between Latin America and Asia is absolutely central for our countries. And it seems to me that business has realized that. I mean, in Chile sells $3 billion worth of cherries to China. This is an extraordinary situation. One product to one country, from one end of the world to another, a very fragile product, cherries. And yet it has happened. So, business realizes where the action is, where the growth is, and where the opportunities are.
Well, this is going to be, working out in a very complex landscape, right? How do you, I mean, in this line, Ambassador, how do you and the other co-authors of your latest book think that classic institutions of the global order will evolve? I mean, institutions such as NATO, the UN, with its controversial National Security Council, right? And the World Trade Organization, for this matter, which seems to be very important for countries like Latin American countries and Asian countries, right?
Sure. Well, look, we have to deal, a good friend and colleague of mine, Amitabh Bachchan, has spoken now recently of how do we deal with the world minus one? By that he means that as the United States exits international organizations, well, the world goes on. And so we have to deal with that. So the notion that the United States leaves these entities shouldn't mean, like, we hear some people say, that say Chile or other countries should do the same. I mean, that will be a very silly thing. We still need multilateralism. And in fact, you could argue we need more than ever, given the magnitude of the challenges the world is facing. So countries like Chile, like Brazil, like Colombia and others, and also obviously countries in Asia, should continue to work together for multilateral mechanisms that allow us to deal with these enormous challenges.
Excellent. Ambassador, before we finish, let me ask you a question more specifically about China and Latin America. What is clear is that, a world order without rules makes us all more susceptible to what you label in your book, quote unquote, whims of Western capitals, right? Does this also apply to the relationship with China? I ask this because later on in the book, you argue that for Latin American leaders and decision makers, the real question is how to continue leveraging these ties with China without becoming China lovers or sympathizers of the Chinese Communist Party. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this idea?
Of course. The point is this. This is not a question, as it is sometimes framed, of being in favor of the China's political model or in favor of the Chinese Communist Party. That is not the issue. The issue is how do you deal with an environment in which there is this duopoly of power that allows our countries to have an opportunity to make the most of it. And my point is this. In many ways, the United States is a more advanced technologically and scientifically economy. It has many advantages. I studied in the United States. I've lived there and worked for a long time. But at the same time, China is making considerable progress as well in science and technology and business and others. So what we would like to see is competition, that the United States and China compete for the favor of our developing countries, and we take advantage of those opportunities. And this has nothing to do with ideological preferences. It's simply a pragmatic decision on the part of our foreign policy makers, so that our countries can continue to develop, to attract more trade, more investment, more financing.
Okay, Ambassador, to finish, a final reflection on your. Are you optimistic moving forward? Are you optimistic about the the chances for middle powers for Latin American countries, mostly for most of the Southeast Asian countries as well, in terms of their capacity to continue to develop this active non-alignment strategy? Are you optimistic based on recent developments moving forward?
I am, absolutely. I mentioned earlier the speech by Prime Minister Carney in Davos, that we would have never thought that the Canadian Prime Minister would come out endorsing basically a position of active non-alignment. But there you have it. It seems to me what has happened over the past 6 years, ever since we came up with this concept, is that developments have ratified the notion that the worst thing countries can do in this environment is simply take sides. Because if you do that, you lose all leverage. The whole point of active non-alignment is to keep your options open. We are living in a very uncertain environment. There is much at stake. If you put all your eggs in one basket and something hits that basket, well, you're done for. So that is not what you should do. On the contrary, you should keep your options open. You should, hedge your bets, a term that is very relevant in finance, but it's also now being applied in international politics. You hedge your bets. You move perhaps one step forward, 2 steps backwards. You cover your back. And that is the best way to proceed in this very difficult and troubled world.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. We've come to the end of our episode. It's been a very insightful dialogue, Ambassador. Thank you so much for your time. And to all of our followers, don't miss out on our next episode in which we will continue to explore the business landscape and overall opportunities between Latin America and Asia. Bye-bye. Thank you, Ambassador. Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.